I'll start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Committee. Welcome to the members, and Councilmember Friedson has joined us in your third committee. Well, we're returning to our favorite subject. I will just say at the outset, I know we're all committed to transportation demand management. We're all committed to reaching our non-auto driver mode share goals and partnering with our businesses to get their employees onto transit and telecommuting, both to reduce congestion and to address our climate crisis. And I know there's a lot of interest in rationalizing and simplifying the TMAG process, which has bedeviled people for years. So I think we're all interested in this bill, but there still remains a lot of concern about it. And the devil is really in the details. So I think because there's concern about the bill as it is, and we want to be responsive to the request to return to it, I think we have about 45 minutes today. And my goal would be hopefully to have a work session, let Dr. Orlin and Ms. Myhill talk us through any of the pain points that we need to discuss, have some possibly straw votes to get the committee's sense of the committee on some of those decisions, and then have a cleaner, more updated version of the bill that we might be able to shop around to stakeholders, maybe convene a meeting of some of the stakeholders so that they could understand the updated bill, and then move it out after that point. I also wanted to take that time in the meantime to ask the administration to hopefully return to us with a proposed fee schedule and some proposals for how the fees would be spent, because I think that would help to address some of the concern from stakeholders in the community about the bill. Nobody likes paying more of a fee than they'd like to, but I think they would be, the bill would be more palatable if they saw kind of a proposed ceiling on any new fees and also knew what they were getting for it. So if there was more detail provided would be really helpful to a lot of people that have been looking at this bill for a long time. Is that a fair way to proceed? Any violent objections?
No violent objections.
Okay.
No, there is a fee estimated in the fiscal impact statement that was with the bill. Mm-hmm. There was an increase from 10 cents to 12.5 cents, and the rationale at the time was to keep the proportion of general fund support to transportation demand management level with expansion of the program. But we can take a look at that in more detail. I just say that there's no requirement that you adopt a new fee at all with passage of this bill. It could be applied exactly as it's been. It could be applied to the same types of developments at the same timelines that it has been. Mm-hmm. And you could consider adjusting fees as you consider expanding the geographic scope, because the bill as it's written also applies to districts, and at the moment we only have the transportation management districts that we have. Right. So unless we set up new transportation demand management districts, it won't apply in a broader geography than it already does. So there's lots of scope.
Right. Which you envision doing.
Which we envision doing, but we have not outlined, at least in the last 6 months, a specific proposal to do that, knowing that there was other work to do here. So there's lots and lots of flexibility in how the executive might propose and how council might want to respond to actually making the intentions of this bill real.
Right. No, I appreciate that, and I think while you might see the flexibility as a good thing, there are members of the community who might think of the flexibility as a source of anxiety. Yeah. So helping them address that by being really clear on what you envision in the future, especially for new fees in new areas, for example, might help us to get to a place where we could get this out and everybody could be singing its praises.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
Anybody else? Dr. Orlin.
Thank you. Just to point out that Chris Conklin and Sandy Brecker and Gary Ehrenrich from DOT are here, and Eric Gray from Park and Planning are here to answer any questions you want to have from the staffs. And that there are 4 separate actions for this whole program, if you will. There's the bill. There's whatever the executive eventually sends over as proposed executive regs, which explains the bill a lot better. And you see in this packet 2 sets of draft regs, as you see 2 sets of bills, because you have the Leggett version, the Elridge version of both. And there's the 3rd and 4th steps, which is the definition of the TMD boundaries and the rates, which would follow after I mean, I understand you want to get the information about what the whole thing might look like, and that's great, but the actual action of it would not happen until after at the executive regs, and be a separate transmission coming over. And the last thing I'll say is, for introduction, of course, is that the rates themselves and the amount of money that's generated and what it's used for also varies not just by the boundaries of the TMD, but whether or not it's applied to existing development or just as well as new or just new. It can make a huge difference because obviously the assessable base, if you want to call it that, for the TMD, if it includes the existing, would reduce the size of that fee considerably from what it is now. Okay, so that is background. Just going through the packet, starting on page 4, just highlighting the places where, in bold, where I've made a recommendation, which is basically either agreeing with the well, there are two executives, the Leggett version of the bill, the Elrich version of the bill, or a third way, if you will, something usually in between, or making some other kinds of comments. So on page 4, I think this is a relatively minor issue. The bill talks about the fact that the goals, the NADMS goals, should be those that are in master plans now or in the SSP, and where they don't exist in certain areas, that it should be 5% higher than what is currently measured by Park and Planning when they make their estimates. What I'm recommending is something slightly different, which is that in the next SSP that the Planning Board is going to be developing and sending to you next year, that include recommendations for both employer and residential NADMS for each of the areas that don't have them now, and that those should be, deliberated over, and what ultimately something would be approved for all of them by November of next year, which is when the SSP is done. And this 5% idea would only be in effect if there are, rates and TMDs in effect before then. So that way it's actually, we've completed the matrix, if you will, that's on page 1, circle 172. So I guess that's my first recommendation.
Sorry, I need you to state
Page
that
4.
again. So in the SSP, you're recommending that there should be NADMS goals assigned to boundaries, assigned to districts around the county, but they don't exist yet.
If you look on circle 172.
Wait, sorry, can I just ask another question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's fine. If we, the chairman has outlined a very practical approach going forward, but it would not have us adopting this law at this time. So how does that timeline match what you just described as well?
I guess it depends upon when DOT can get back with their draft
I
proposal.
don't think all of those steps would be completed well in advance of the SSP being before you. I think it's probably, if we moved on the bill in relatively short order, I think those things would be hard pressed to get done by the time you adopt the SSP.
Exactly.
So it's probably okay that the SSP, as Glenn has suggested, would define the targets for those areas that don't currently have targets.
So we wouldn't necessarily have to say it has to be 5% higher.
I think
you don't have to say anything.
The law would probably refer to the adopted SSP having established targets rather than us having separately done it through executive regulation.
The only reason why I'm saying it the way I am is just in case for some reason all these steps are taken by next June or something, we wouldn't be delaying things until November. But, if you want to just assume it's not going to happen until November anyway, then
I think we have an issue with this bill generally with sort of like hypotheticals that are causing anxiety. So, here we have one with maybe there's no harm in taking it out. So,
so
it would just refer to.
We have no objection to changing the reference to be goals established in the subdivision staging policy rather than having us do something differently.
Okay. All right.
Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that. Thank you to the chair for, I think what Councilmember Reamer referred to as a thoughtful approach to this. I think I share some of this anxiety that has been raised, some of the hypotheticals, and I think some of those hypotheticals would lead to unintended but bad outcomes for what our overall and overarching goal is, which is to reach our environmental goals, to get people out of cars, to get them into alternative forms of transportation that are better for the environment, that more reflect the communities that we're trying to build, to drive towards our non-auto driver mode share. I think this is one way to address it. I think all of us philosophically are not opposed to the idea of TDMs. I do think, though, this recent conversation that we're having right now about the reference to the SSP and others raises a broader question of how does this fit into all the other fees that we have and all the other mechanisms that we're trying to utilize in order to, in various ways, through fees to fund transportation infrastructure, through carrots and sticks to drive our non-owner driver mode share goals. And I'm concerned that it feels often, and this is, I think, a particularly acute example of how we are having these conversations at different times in different contexts, and we haven't necessarily had the conversation together. Ultimately, there's one set of goals. We want to drive up our non-owner driver mode share. We want to reach our environmental goals. We want to have development occur near transit. We want to make sure that we're funding these alternative forms of transportation to drive people out of single occupancy vehicles. The costs are being borne by particular buildings, particular developments, particular property owners, particular residents. And the question is, who should pay for it? How should we pay for it? How do we get there? And between the UMPs, or the bump in Bethesda, this as another example, the subdivision staging policy, they're all different ways that we're addressing it. And I think we are lacking an intentional and comprehensive conversation where we look at all of the different costs, all of the different programs, figure out how should they be paid for, what should we be doing, what is the best way to go about it. And I think that we may be having part of the conversation here, but not the other part of the conversation. And so while I think that it would make it less complicated if we took out the reference to the subdivision staging policy, I think it really highlights the fact that all of these things are interrelated and they all have specific impacts on specific residents, and we ought to be having the conversation in tandem, because while the policies could be different, the practicality is the same. They're being borne by certain people to accomplish certain goals, and I think it's still unclear of what is a TMD expense, what is an UMP expense, what is an SSP requirement. Ultimately, it's somewhat a distinction without a difference. So I just wanted to raise that. And I just want to also highlight, I mean, I am very supportive of the overarching goal here of TMDs. I think we all are. I think it's a shared interest that we all have. I think the question is, what's the best way to move forward, and how do we get people on board? I think we've talked about before, and I think the last conversation this committee had, about carrots are more effective than sticks, of having better transportation options, having better transit alternatives, the best way to move forward. Obviously, that comes with requirement for funding, and I really do appreciate that I had requested this committee move forward with restoring the $500,000 for the Fair Share program, which was part of the part of the TMD that is currently instituted. That the department has really been helpful and really been great in meeting with stakeholders and trying to improve that process and that program so that businesses are actually able to utilize in the way that it's intended. I think there are ways to move forward where we can bring people together, and I just think it's important that we get everybody on the same page, that we get all of these trains on the same track, and that we actually have the comprehensive conversation to achieve these goals with the right people at the same time in the same place.
Councilmember Friedson, I don't disagree with you at all. I think what we just agreed is try to align the goal setting with the subdivision staging policy to address that disconnect that you've identified precisely.
Can we add the UMP into that conversation as well, and how that relates vis-a-vis?
Different animal, because that's really focused on infrastructure funding. Yes, it's related. Yes, there are services in the UMP that people would take advantage of through this program. This program is really geared around the communication of what options are available. And as you described, the incentive programs that right now we have, the Fair Share program, there could be others that are identified as helpful to this. That the TDM program is really about communicating the availability of these options, not so much how do we provide the infrastructure. Of course they're related, but I don't know that there's a one-to-one correspondence between those here. And there's already a TMD in operation in Bethesda where the bump is covering that. So we're not really proposing a change to that relationship with this bill. I understand that we want to coordinate all those things, though.
Okay. Dr. Orland.
Okay, so make sure I understand. So on page 4, the recommendation, the unanimous recommendation of the committee, or about setting the goals as part of the SSP for those areas that don't have goals?
Just without objection. Yeah.
Okay, good. Got to keep track too. Keep score, as it were. Okay, go Nats.
Don't fall asleep on this game.
Oh boy.
They're already voting for you.
Jeez, what are you going to do? There you go.
Well, that's right.
Way to suck up.
You got a St. Louis guy here.
All right, top of page 5, moving on, sorry. This is a relatively minor point, too. Both versions of the bills would broaden the requirement to submit a traffic mitigation plan. Currently, the law requires all employers of 25 or more to do a mitigation plan for its employees. There's no penalty, I don't believe, for actually not doing it, but it is a requirement in the law. And what the law, since the law anticipates, although it doesn't implement, anticipates broadening this to most of the county. It says that the TMD, the requirement for employers of 25 or more would still apply in red areas as they are now, but all red areas, not just those that have TMD. So Wheaton and Glenmont, for example, are not part of TMD, and it would be required there. And in orange areas, it's 100 or more, and yellow areas, 200 or more employees. So if you're a really large employer in a yellow area, you would be required to do a mitigation plan. My only comment here, it's a really pretty minor one, is that White Oak is a TMD. It's not been established operationally, but it is created under law. And so this should not, I don't think the 25 or more should apply to White Oak because it's in an orange area, it's not in a red area, so it should be 100 or more in that area. But other than that, I agree with what both bills are saying in terms of what the requirement would be for a traffic mitigation plan.
Great.
I could just provide a little bit of context on this one. When the White Oak Science Gateway Master Plan was adopted, the TMD was adopted around the same time. So our expectation was that
They'd be
they were
further along.
that they would be further along, and that the expectation was that the rules would have been like the other TMDs, that was 25. So this would be a change from that. I don't know that it's a significantly important change, but it is a change. And there are other non-red areas in other TMDs with the 25 employee requirement.
And in those areas, for example, North Bethesda the TMD is mostly in a red area, but there's a little bit of it. Montgomery Mall area, which is actually in a orange area.
We actually have all,
Sorry?
we actually have all three. There are portions of the North Bethesda TMD that have red, orange, and even a little yellow.
Even yellow.
Yes, amazing.
But
We are
since
right-
the overwhelming part of it is red, the idea there it would be 25 or more, as it is now. But but White Oak, since it's entirely orange, would be 100. Okay.
I think we agree.
The next item has to do with, and I really apologize for this. This probably caused some confusion. The bottom of page 5. The existing law that's been in effect for, Sandy, how long? 15 years or so or more?
At least, yeah.
Authorizes the council to charge a TMD fee within TMDs on not just new development, but also existing development, at least existing commercial and multifamily residential, so low-rise and high-rise apartments, not townhouses, not single-family. The council has, when it establishes the rates, it establishes it in the rate resolution that you do every year in May for parking and transit and all that. And the council's, up to this point, has never actualized or approved a fee on existing development, but under law you're authorized to do that. And neither of the bills, both of the bills, continues that authorization. And so, again, I didn't make that very clear at the bottom of page 5, but I can point to where it is in the existing bills in the packet that, in fact, it is authorized currently.
Yes, and the executive branch, I don't think, has ever proposed that fee.
No, it's never been proposed, never been approved. It's always been only on new development. But again, that's a discussion to have later when you establish the boundaries and set the rates, whether you want to change that or not. But this bill doesn't change the status of that.
It's authorized presently in the boundaries of TDMs.
Within the boundaries of TDMs, right. And this bill anticipates that the TDM boundaries would change, but again, the TDM boundaries won't change until you take up that third step. So it's,
Which is in the,
Adoption of new TMDs. We would propose boundaries of new TMDs.
you would send over a new,
We would send that to the council. The council would have the opportunity to weigh in on whether those were appropriate or should be established or not.
That's part
And
3.
then even separately from that, the executive would propose fees in those TMDs, and you would once again have the opportunity to weigh in whether those fees were appropriate or not.
You have those-
Until all of those steps happen, this only applies where it already exists.
right.
Do you have those drafted?
No, and we haven't proposed anything yet. We're
I know
just
you
trying to
haven't.
get the foundation
Well,
set.
we did propose.
Yeah, there is the TMD, if this packet looks familiar, it's mostly the same one you had 6 months ago. But in that packet, it had a draft, I call it that, from DOT as to what the boundaries would be, the TMDs, not the rates, but the boundaries.
It was an illustrative
Yeah.
map.
Okay.
It was nowhere near actually making a formal proposal. But
was it the whole county, or what was it?
It was
yellow
not-
and
everything but the green areas.
green was not.
Leaving ag on.
So it was not the ag reserve.
And we had
No.
thought about whether you would structure it geographically or structure it by policy area color, or structure it, as Glenn had suggested in another version of it,
Right.
reorganizing the existing boundaries to be more geographically logical. But none of those is a proposal at this point. They're all illustrations of how that could be achieved in different ways.
Right, but I think you appreciate, my own view in getting us to the finish line would be doing some of these steps, minimizing the amount of time between some of these steps might relieve some of the anxiety stemming from the hypotheticals, as Mr. Reamer said.
Well, we don't have any problem with moving quickly through those steps after this, but we haven't
Sure.
tried to prejudge what the outcomes
I
are.
hear you. So let's get the bill in a place where we're comfortable with it, and then I think when people see more flesh on the bones, they're going to be more comfortable with the whole direction here. Sure, Councilmember Fritz.
Very quick, and I appreciate the indulgence of the chair and committee. If there has never been an interest and there's an expressed not going to be an interest, as has been indicated today, that we're not going to levy this on existing buildings, which is one of the large areas of concern, because that is a tax. If you add a new fee to an existing building where a new decision isn't being made, that's not a fee, that's a tax, at least from my perspective and from the perspective of many others. Why would we include it in the bill? I just want to raise.
It's not in the bill, it's in the existing law.
The bill continues the same language.
But we're addressing a bill that is addressing what is in existing law.
It's in the boundaries.
Well,
It's not the law. Well, it's in the law.
I can give you my guess as to why it's in the law. And the guess is that pushing on the mode split with just new development, at some point we might find that we're not able to achieve the goals based on just new development. And there may be the need for greater participation of existing development to meet those goals. In order to support that, the fee might be levied on existing development. But we're nowhere near making that decision, nor have we been in the last 15 years of managing this program. But it may be something that's needed in the longer term. So that's my guess as to why it's in the existing legislation.
I don't think it's a need for discussion today, but I think that is one of the large bases for significant concern, is that we are keeping it in there. We're keeping it in there not because it's already in there and we don't want to have to deal with it. We're keeping it in there because there may be a time, as it just was expressed by the executive branch, that the executive branch may send something over. And I think that is a major area of
I think people might
concern.
believe it's an expansion of council authority when it's not, in fact, an expansion of council authority. And I'm not sure whether anybody wants to propose a reduction of council authority, but it's just a continuance of existing authority. So there's probably people we need to have that conversation with. Dr. Orland.
Just to wrap this up, on Circle 29, you'll see part of the existing law, and you'll see in lines 732 through 742, and particularly lines 741, 742, that it authorizes the council to be able to charge it to existing commercial and multifamily residential. And so, again, it hasn't changed by this bill. Okay, I'm sorry, we lost track of where I was. Okay,
not in the bill.
page 6.
Right.
Okay, now we're talking about new developments, and the bills, both versions of the bills refer to what's called level 1, 2, or 3 plans, and it depends upon the size. Sorry, page 6. It depends on the size of the developments, and this is, I guess, a relatively minor point too, but I think it's important. Both versions of the bill would have these requirements apply to any commercial development and basically anything except single-family detached housing developments. And my recommendation is to also not apply it to single-family attached developments. So if you have a townhouse, solely a townhouse development, that would not be something that you would be requiring, these kinds of plans for, whether it's depending on the size 1, 2, or 3. Nor would they be subject to the annual TMD fee. They are not now. And you've heard this from the other jurisdictions that came here in June, as well as Sandy's mentioned this several times. It's very, very difficult to market TMD to single-family homes, whether it's single, detached, or attached. Now, if there is a development that includes some townhouses, but also multifamily and mixed use and office, that's different. But if it's solely townhouse, my recommendation is we should exempt them as well.
I don't object. There's no examples of, say, townhouse communities that have a van pool set up or something like that?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, we do, nevertheless, regardless of this, we would still do some more broad-based marketing to everyone within a certain geographic area. We do, blasts, e-blasts. We do some direct marketing. There are few instruments anymore left to really reach out to the community at large in print form, but to some extent we do that. But there are no requirements, and that is the way that we feel is the best, because it is extremely difficult. You don't have a mechanism for reaching those folks other than the bully pulpit.
Okay, going to page 7, and, I'm sorry, bottom of page 6, I missed that one. Again, I think this is a relatively small point, but currently there are commuter surveys that are circulated to employers and TMDs, and the average rate of response has been 22%. The bill sets a goal of 60% to be achieved, but that's all it is. It's a goal. There's no penalty, none, if an employer or a group of employers don't meet that goal. But the idea is we want to get a higher response rate if at all possible, because it gives you more statistically reliable information. For example, a lot of master plans base their staging on reaching a certain mode share goal, and if you're only getting 22%, that's not as statistically reliable as if it were a higher percentage. But I agree with the development community that 60% seems awfully high, and so I'm suggesting maybe the bill change that to 40% as a goal. But again, this is all judgment.
This is an area where we have a disagreement with Glenn, mostly because the requirement to apply this goes down to employees of 25, so that if we are lowering this goal too much, we may be talking about a very small group of employees in a company. And in smaller employers, we definitely want to get a larger sample, so we're pretty uncomfortable with going below 50% as the goal for these, just because we want to make sure we're representing at least half the employees of smaller companies.
And while there's no penalty for not completing your survey, what kind of follow-up was done with employers, and what kind of carrots?
I'll let Sandy speak to that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
we do incentivize the employers to respond and to help us with responding, as well as providing incentives for the employees that we're trying to get through the employer to access. So we have all kinds of promotional elements here. They can win prizes through high response rates, incentives, and we also have drawings for the employees as well. So the representatives at the employer site can benefit, and the people who are actually the ones who have to respond. We can't, just like any other survey, we can't compel people to respond to a survey. even with the census. I mean, we don't have penalties, all of us, if we don't respond. So we do everything that we can to try to incentivize people to do that. But the idea of making judgments on non-auto driver mode share based on less than 50% as a goal does concern us.
How would you, how are you going to double the response rate, though? Is that achievable?
Well, this is overall, okay? So we have employers that actually do achieve 80% to 100%. We do have some employers who really take this seriously. How we're going to double it, I can't tell you right now, but we're going to work at it.
I think it's a little easier for an employer to get their employees to respond. But what about, this also applies, how does it apply to an apartment building owner?
Well, we do have some residential surveys currently being conducted, and we do a lot of outreach. We go in the evenings, we go on weekends, we have events, we have pizza parties, we have ice cream socials. We have all kinds of other things that we try to incentivize the multi-family buildings with. We don't have a lot of them. We have a limited number of those in each of the TMDs now.
But can you envision realistically an apartment building that you don't actually have a lot of resources to get into because now we've expanded the pool? How are they going to get to 50% response rate without a lot of help from you, which is, it sounds like a very likely scenario if we proceed with this legislation.
So right now, with our TMDs that have residential goals, we are doing that.
You're getting to 50%?
Well, we are getting significant response rates. I'd have to look to see on a building-by-building basis what it is. But I know that, well, Peggy, I don't think Peggy Schwartz is here. Kristen is here. The number of buildings that are in the Bethesda TMD, what was the number roughly of multi-unit residential?
It was over 70 in the plan area.
70 in the
50%
plan.
of the buildings are,
70 actual properties that were surveyed.
they're residential.
Multi-unit residential.
So what is the response rate in those?
Well, they're just about to do it. This is the first time we've had goals in the Bethesda TMD.
Oh, okay.
We've had them in the North Bethesda area, and we have had, pretty good response rates
What
in
would be
that.
the timeline for that?
We're starting it within a week or two here, I think. We're going,
Residential started.
has it started? Okay.
Through mid-November.
Yeah,
Well,
we
no.
conducted over a number of weeks, yeah.
We use that as a real example to help inform this, because I don't really like saying this is a stretch goal and there's no enforcement. I think businesses want to comply with a rule that we set, and they're going to make a best effort. And if we set it too far out of what is really possible, it's just going to create a lot of resentment. Let's make sure we're accurate. And I think we may need a different goal for an employer versus a community.
That's a possibility, yeah.
Yeah. So can we just be really refined here, and let's not embrace something that we think maybe it's not going to be attainable, but there's no penalty, so it's okay. I would prefer that we just do what we think. It could be a stretch goal, but it's got to be something we can say credibly, with a realistic effort, we think you can make this happen. And that needs to be based on some information. That
Yeah, and we
some-
can look
some
at
examples.
what we have achieved in North Bethesda and the other areas where we have done residentially based surveys. It is our hope, I would add, that over the next several years, that technology may help us out in this regard, both with regard to the employee and the residential surveys. And we have other data sources for residential that we don't have for the employees. So that's another avenue that we are exploring.
And this is in the law? Is this something that we should not necessarily have in the law because it needs to be adjusted every couple of years as technology improves? What's the best way to?
You're suggesting taking it out of the current law, which does say 80%?
I'm just having a dialogue here, but I'm asking you, let's get this right. Let's have a refined way of thinking about this. If you just said you thought this field is going to change a lot in the next couple of years,
Right.
Well, I'm hoping that will be to the positive.
My
Yeah.
guess is we should probably move on from this
Okay.
topic, but
Yeah.
maybe we
We have no objection to looking
Okay.
into that.
We could suggest you come back with a plan for, looking at what's working, looking at what's not working, what incentives might need additional funding or something else, and with the promise of technology in the future, and maybe separating the goals for employers and employees, and getting back to us with those kind of details. and we'll put our thinking caps on as well. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've held off up until now because this is probably the fourth work session on this, and I've wanted it to be a work session, not a philosophical disagreement, right, which it can easily devolve into. But on this specific point, over the summer, we had a marathon 3.5-hour work session where we heard from the Council of Governments, the District of Columbia, Fairfax, Arlington, and Alexandria. And so to have a conversation about best practices and we don't know what will work or we're not quite sure how we can get to certain goals, my broader question is, what had we learned from our 3.5-hour session about best practices in the Washington, D.C. region about transportation demand management? And I'm not sure if any of that information had been reflected in this legislation. I know the PowerPoints are part of, or were, actually, they are not. So, right, so this is a 207-page packet that does not include any of the PowerPoint presentations, which is a good thing. But it doesn't include any of the information that we learned. And if we want this to be right, I want to learn from other jurisdictions that are doing this work and doing it better than us. And that's an undeniable statement. Now, I know it's not apples to apples. The District of Columbia and Arlington are different jurisdictions, but there's got to be some morsels to learn from them. And I'll stop talking because I want to get through the actual work of this work session, but we had a 3.5-hour work session during the summer, and I don't think we should ignore the information that we learned, and we should continue to follow up with those jurisdictions to try and receive best practices.
I think that's a good point. I have a lot of notes from that, and I'm sure you do, Dr. Orlin, and incorporating some of those in the next packet or just sending us a memo would probably be really helpful.
All right.
Because I've always assumed wherever we go with this bill, this is not the be-all and end-all on TMD, and we're all going to have ideas of where we should go in the future.
Yes.
Right.
And just to be clear, a lot of those best practices were researched by us when this bill was being drafted, and a lot of those thoughts were incorporated in the legislation that was transmitted. We'd be happy to go back and look at the presentations from the summer and identify how those things, either from the summer or from our earlier work, are reflected in this.
And just so you know, oftentimes our program is held out as a best practice to other jurisdictions as well.
Okay, going to page 7, and I might need a little help on this one because it's a little complicated. The bill and the regs talk about a sample menu of measures that need to be taken for level 1 plans. Level 1 plans are those for the smallest of the developments that would fit under this bill. And what I'm recommending here is that, and this has to do with really more with the draft reg in the bill, to basically have it so that the level 1 plans require the level 1 plans provide less than maximum parking, prohibit the building and requiring bundled parking, and provide at least 2% of spaces for carpools and van pools. But they come with 2 caveats. One is providing less than the maximum parking and prohibiting bundling by a building owner would be required only of buildings in red areas that have their own private parking, so it would not be required of those in yellow areas or orange areas. And secondly, that the bundling required by a building owner that may currently existing would continue for the life of the existing lease. You wouldn't cause a lease to have to be broken, to meet this requirement. So as long as that lease goes, you could still have bundling. But when a lease is re-upped in a red area, then the unbundling would be required, which is a little bit different than what the executive is recommending.
I don't think we have any substantive objection to this. These are all elements in the regulation, not in the bill. So we have ample opportunity to figure this out. When we were researching this in response to the packet, we did note that sample menu is reflected in the bill, and those references should be deleted because the sample menu is simply a sample that the regulations would point to.
Okay, great.
Getting close to the end. Bottom page 7. The requirement for level 2 plans in the Leggett bill says that each of the developments need to meet the goal that's been set when the plan was approved, when the development was approved. The Elrich bill would have such plans make measurable progress to be 5% above the NADMS goals. And my recommendation is to concur with the original language in the Leggett bill, which is once the goal is set, that's what should be attained, not try to raise it higher.
And in this particular instance, I think it's an issue of the language and not of the intent. There was not an intent that we would be changing the goal of a project once it already had something established, but that the goal for a new development in a policy area's goal would be 5% greater than the overall policy area goal, because we're relying largely on new development to make progress where we don't have as many tools for existing development to make the progress.
That actually, before you make a decision on that, it sort of interrelates with the next comment too, and maybe you can think about both at the same time. The Elrich version of the bill the Leggett version of the bill would say that the DOT director within a TMD could recommend a higher number than what the NADMS goal is, or a lower number, depending on the individual circumstance of that development within the TMD. And what we're really talking about is that if you look at data from people who are, the mode split data for developments that are close to metro versus those that are further away from metro, even though they might be in walking distance there, it falls off pretty quickly. You get a very, very high mode share right on top of metro station, but say in Bethesda, right, the metro center, it's much higher than it would be, say, at Battery Lane. And so what the Leggett version of the bill says, give the department director, I'm pointing preemptively Lady Eucharist, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm sure it will, you make that decision. And the Elrich bill puts parameters on it, says you can go up to 5% higher or 5% lower. And my thought is that that's not enough of a spread, that the difference between something that's on top of a metro station and those that are on the edge of a red area, it's much different than 10%. So I would give the director 10% higher or 10% lower within that area, for whether it's a level 2 or level 3 plan. And that kind of relates to the first comment about the 5% above the NADMS goal. So we're talking about you try to achieve 5% higher, and then after that you decide, well, it could be even higher than that or lower than that, depending on how far away you are. So it's
those two requirements are for different plan types. The 5% is for a level 2, which is one that requires that the project make progress towards the goal. The level 3 requires that the project achieve the goal, and that could be over time, but that it achieves the goal. So the threshold for performance is different under those two. That's why there's a distinction between the two in the bill. The 10% range we felt was appropriate to constrain the negotiation and the argument we'll have with each developer who is likely to want to have these goals set as low as possible for their project. I think there is, when we look at the size and shape of some of these policy areas, there is the chance that there could be a 20% variation, as Glenn points out in his notes. But I think we would want to have some more guardrails on how we bump from a 10% range to a 20% range. Otherwise, we're going to always be negotiating at the extremes of this range.
Yeah. And my recommendation was that, and although the bill says for level 3 it's 5% higher or lower, I'm saying that for both level 2 and 3 it should be up to 10% higher, 10% lower.
What would the guardrails be?
I think we could talk about the proximity to a high-quality transit, that if, more than a half a mile from it, then you could have a broader range. Or we can come up with some ideas and share them with the committee.
Distance-based scale.
Probably distance-based or density-based or interaction of uses. If you have an exclusively biotech area without the housing and retail to support it, then the NADMS will not perform as well as if it's mixed, so that the trips can be made within the development, those sorts of measures.
Sounds good.
So, your thoughts about those two things? Do you agree with what Chris is mentioning about the basically saying for the new developments for level 2, it should be 5% higher than what the NADMS goal is, or just what the NADMS goal is, and then the variation whether level 2 or 3 being 5% higher or lower, or 10% higher or lower.
Your staff recommendation is,
To go with the Leggett version of the bill in terms of the level 2 plan, and saying that the goal, generally speaking for that TMD, should be the goal that's set aside in the plan, but that within that, the development may be up to have a required 10% higher, 10% lower, based on proximity to high-quality transit.
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
That's good. Sorry,
I think we're agreeing with you.
yeah, okay, all right. Oh, I had my annual audiology test this morning, and I was recommended again for having hearing aids, so.
Is the committee okay with having a set of criteria for going beyond that initial 10%?
Set of criteria, sorry.
To go beyond the initial 10% range, the 5%
Oh.
higher or lower, before we even consider 10% higher or lower.
Say that again?
A set of so the basic assumption would be that the target would be within 5% of the policy area goal. Under these extreme circumstances where it's the world's greatest mixed-use development on top of Metro, or it's a set of biotech buildings with no amenities, nowhere near the Metro, we may go to 10% range. But I think having the expectation that the range is a full 20% around the goal is too great to start these negotiations for most projects.
So your range is 15%, is that correct?
No, we're 10, he's 20.
Hey,
The
10.
two,
Five aside.
and 5.
5 aside or 10 aside.
All right, let's go with less,
Well, again,
I'm not arguing that there's a project that should be 10% lower somewhere. I just think that needs to be pretty narrowly defined in how we get to that.
right.
But if you're sitting
agree.
right on top of Metro, it doesn't automatically they get the extra 5 or 10.
No.
Depends, like you said, on the type of development it is.
Why don't we work together and develop some parameters that would set that?
We'll come back to this one.
Yeah, I think more restrained here would be better. Yeah.
Okay.
Only a couple more things. If a level 2 plan, and this is actually a comment that was raised by NAOP and AOBA in the Chamber of Commerce. If a level 2 plan doesn't work, what the Elridge plan would require is that parking management would be part of the solution. The Leggett bill didn't do that. It allows for more flexibility. And Gwen Wright recommended the same thing as well. And I agree with the planning director and the Leggett version of the bill that parking management shouldn't be required as the fallback option, mandated. I think what will happen is if the original plan doesn't work, that the only way, or not the only way, a very logical way for it to make it work is parking management. But let that be something that the building owner decides on his or herself, rather than being something that's required.
And again, this is a case where the parking management is viewed by the executive branch is really the only way to really have the project meet its outcome if the other strategies aren't working, and that's why it's emphasized as a requirement.
So what do you think?
Sorry, Councilmember Friedson was distracting me. I gotta confess. Can you just restate the case?
Again, this is if the action plan doesn't work, that's been approved, then what the Elrich version of the bill would then say is that you'd be mandated to do parking management, whether that's reducing the number of spaces, charging more for parking, it could be a whole series of things which is directed at changing the demand or supply of parking. And
Let's not do that.
yeah, my recommendation, I think they're probably in most cases going to have to end up doing that, because I don't disagree at all with what Mr. Elrich and the DOT is saying, that it probably is the most effective way of getting to there, but let that be something
Let that be a negotiated solution, not something that's mandated in the bill.
Right, and the county executive feels that this is a way to enforce these plans and make sure that the outcomes are achieved, and that's why it's been proposed.
Spoken like a true nominee for the Department of Transportation Director position.
And in the end, you have to approve the plan anyway, right? So
That's correct.
you may not, you know what I'm saying.
Look, I mean, I think that we have to be, anyway, never mind.
Okay, so really the last issue I have for you today is a little complicated. We're talking about these level 1, 2, and 3 plans. Well, where do they apply? When is it a level 1? When is it a level 2? When is it a level 3? And the Leggett version of the bill, if you look at the middle of page 9, shows you the range. So if you're in a red area and you have 25,000 square feet or less, you're not required to do a plan at all. 25 to 100,000, you're required to do level 1. Greater than 100,000, you have to do level 3. And the rest of the chart's pretty self-evident. The County Executive Elridge's version of the bill has tighter ranges. Basically, level 1 plan is required of all developments up from very smallest to up to 25,000, and anything above 25,000 requires a level 3, and you see the differences also in the orange and the yellow areas. Park and Planning staff, the top of page 10, this wasn't a recommendation from them, but they were just pointing out that the plan sizes sort of fall in these ranges, and so they said this could be one way of doing it, which is basically a set of numbers which are mostly in between the Leggett and Elridge versions of the bill, and then of course then you've got me, who basically recommending something which is also sort of in the middle. This is obviously pretty much based on judgment. Obviously, the smaller the development is, and the more you require of it, the more likely you're going to get a higher mode share. But the question is, how much do you squeeze? And so you have really 3 sets of recommendations: the Leggett bill, the Elridge bill, and mine, which is sort of in between.
I can give you some background that may make your decision easier as well. When we developed these ranges, both in the Leggett bill and then in the Elridge bill, they were keyed largely around when an employer would be required to do an employer plan. So we were trying to match an expectation of employee density so that we weren't getting people having to do one type of plan and not another. When we've looked at the council staff recommendations, I don't think we really have any objection to the ranges that are proposed here, except that we would want all of the projects within a red area to at least do the minimum plan, which is to coordinate with the county on making the county's TDM resources available within their project. So we would just suggest changing the upper left quadrant number from 20,000 to the NA so that all projects in a red policy area would have to do at least a level 1 plan, which is to identify a benefits coordinator and coordinate with the county for the county to promote its programs at that location.
Also, the next cell over, under level 1, it would be 40,000 or less. Right?
Correct, right.
This is new development.
This is for new development, correct. The employer plans are based on number of employees, not on square footage.
I'm fine with that.
Can you repeat that point again? Because I'm trying to bring together this square footage
Yes.
component with the employee component.
Correct.
So restate.
There are 2 different sets of thresholds. For an employer, it's, I don't remember the numbers, 25, 100, and 200
right.
employees based on the policy area. And when we
Over 25 in the red now.
When we developed our recommendations for square footage of projects, we tried to look at expected number of employees per square feet so that they were aligned. What the planning department did is try to look at what ranges are projects falling in. And then what Glenn did was mash all of these recommendations up into something that blended all of those items. I think from our perspective, we were okay with the council staff recommendation that's based probably more closely on what development sizes are clustering than the others, except that we wanted to be sure that all projects in a red policy area participated in at least the minimum way of identifying a TDM coordinator on the site and making resources available for the county to come and promote TDM at their project. So that changed the less than 20,000 to not applicable, and as Glenn mentioned, the level 1 basic to greater than, is it greater or less than 40? Less than 40,000 square feet.
And so, would there be an instance of allowing a small business, gracing them in the first instance with the number of employees, but then capturing them in the square footage component?
Well, now, these are for developments.
Right.
Even though we're talking about, numbers of employees that are
Right.
generated, if they are in a TMD and they have 25 or more employees, they still need to work with us. But this is about the development projects.
Okay.
So it's not the tenants in that building.
Well, so,
It's-
because that was
Yeah.
that was where I was going, so thank
Yeah.
you for that. Okay.
Now, having a program for their building would certainly help them with their,
Right.
I'm fine with the staff recommendation with that amendment.
Well, I don't know if you heard me, I'm basically okay with what Chris is saying, but I don't know if you want to agree with
He's agreeing with you with the, down to going, with the requirement that everybody has the coordinator and makes resources available.
Okay, so in other words,
NA.
Keep in mind that this is,
NA for red, under no requirements. And
0 to
Less
40.
than 40,000 for.
these are developments in the
Yes.
red area. So a building these days doesn't often go up around a metro station that is
that
less than
size.
20,000 square feet.
Right.
That's correct.
So there may not be any projects.
That's definitely
If
possible.
they are already an existing building that's just keeping within its own rights, it doesn't even have to go through the development process.
That's correct.
So the committee's recommendation is, council staff's recommendation, except that the no requirements under red would be NA, and level 1 basic would be less than 40,000. Correct. Otherwise it'd be the same. Okay,
Great.
we're done.
Okay, we're done at 3:01. Okay. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for inviting us.